You know, when we invite these speakers, these top-notch speakers, there's frequently a book involved, and I get to read it, and usually it inspires a lot of questions in me. I have so many things I want to ask the speaker after I read their books, usually. And this is Luke's book, Race to the Bottom, and you'll see if you look at my book, it's just glommed up with notes and exclamation points and all kinds of things. I penned the heck out of this book. But I didn't have the normal number of questions that I usually have. In fact, I was rather speechless. The only thing I could say was I thought maybe that book needs to be retitled and called Hijacked, because that's really what's happened to the American education system. It is astonishing. But maybe Luke will make that the sequel. Like the messages shared by previous speakers, Tom Homan and upcoming speaker Robert Malone, both highly knowledgeable in their fields. Tonight's speaker, too, shares how forces controlling government decisions profoundly affecting our lives are not what they appear to be. God saw it was right when he shared with us about parasitic ideas, and boy, we have not just a virus, but a serious parasite of ideas in American education. Trust in our institutions has been severely decimated over the last year and a half. Many of us, based on history and based common understanding of human nature, are simply not enthused by increasing central control and power. And even those of us concerned enough to ask for increased transparency from our government agencies will be, well, impressed with the level of organization, deception, in our system of education. The intentions and priorities and focus that Luke documents are astounding. Our system, mind you, that produces appalling results. California ranked 30th in math skills, with 8th graders demonstrating the capabilities generally of the 5th grade level. Worrisome? In 2020, this is one of my favorite facts, the California Assembly voted to stop requiring teachers to pass the basic California Education Skill Test, which measures whether they can read at an 8th grade level. Yeah, that was unfair. It must have hurt somebody's feelings. I don't know. Feelings are very important, especially in math. And did you know that California has abolished the use of the ACT and SAT scores for college admissions? Because even though they were great predictors of success. Yep, gone, right? This failure is not restricted in any way to California. It's ubiquitous across the nation. So are we indoctrinating or are we educating? After the decimation of education and the well-being of children during the shutdown, Luke asked two profound questions. What kind of people would exploit a moment of national vulnerability for their own gain? And if they would do this, what else have they been up to for all these years? Luke Rosiak works as an investigative reporter for the Daily Wire and formerly for the Daily Caller and the Washington Post. His dedication to tenacious, high-quality research led him not only to document the corruption, bloat, and failure in our public school system and academia all over, but to break the Loudoun County school rape cover-up story that launched a parental movement like no other. He describes one of those stories about how sausages is made that you will not forget. Ladies and gentlemen, Luke Rosiak.
Thank you, Jane. What a great group. I'm so excited to be here. I flew in from Loudoun County last night, and it's so funny to hear about people talking about Loudoun County all over the country, because there's really nothing special about Loudoun County schools. It's honestly just where I live, so it's what I documented because it was the easiest thing to do. But the point is, the problems that you hear about in Loudoun, they're everywhere. It's just a matter of how closely you look. I mean, Loudoun is almost like a metaphor, because these problems are in every single school district, obviously, especially around here. Because Loudoun County, by the way, is kind of rural and somewhat conservative. It was controlled entirely by Republicans until 2015. So if that's how bad Loudoun County is, you can imagine how bad San Francisco's schools are. Yeah, let me raise this microphone since I'm taller than Jane. So I wrote this book about schools, and I've kind of become known as the schools guy. But I'm a investigative reporter for the Daily Wire, so I work for Ben Shapiro. I'm not going to speak as quickly as him because my whole talk would be done in 5 minutes, and it would be time to go home. But it's exciting to work for the Daily Wire. They have a really optimistic outlook because sometimes it's like we're just being. The left is so insidious. They control every institution, and a lot of times it's tempting just to criticize and complain. And the Daily Wire has such optimism and such courage. Their view is we're not just going to nitpick, we're not just going to argue, we're not just going to complain, we're going to create our own competing culture. And they're doing things like investing $100 million in creating kids' TV programming that's frankly apolitical. They don't want to brainwash your kids to be little Matt Walshes. They just don't want, they want apolitical stuff. They want the cartoons that, we grew up watching. And so I think that's fantastic. It's exciting to be a part of the Daily Wire team. But, I spent most of my career as a Washington reporter, walking around the halls of Congress, following federal spending, documenting all of the problems in the federal government, and there's many of them. And I was always really excited about that. I thought if you want to be involved in politics or journalism, Washington is the place to be. It's like being in the major leagues, right? And around 2019, I started realizing everything I thought I knew was wrong. I had made a big mistake, like a lot of us do in politics and in Washington, in thinking that the federal government was the most important thing. And I realized it's actually local government. And this is kind of the big scam of our times, is that a lot of people thought we're all sitting around, well, how do you feel about Donald Trump? How do you feel about Hillary Clinton? And meanwhile, they're waltzing into our school board, into our city council meetings and completely taking over. And the other side is doing that because they know that it matters. And it took us a little while to figure it out. Frankly, we all have our opinion about the president and so on, and frankly, it probably doesn't matter much what we think. There's not much we can do about it. But it turns out we can do a whole lot about the stuff that's happening in our own backyards. And so in early 2019, a couple things happened that got me started thinking about schools. The first is that where I live, there was 10 Democrats on the school board. Not a single one of them had kids in the school system. And when I learned that fact, I was just so struck by it. I mean, not one of them had kids. They were all there for their own reasons, pushing their own pet projects. One of them's like a gay rights activist. One of them's like in, professional, Islam lady. They've all got their own little political angle that they're working, and one of them's an environmentalist, and to her the school system is a way to get a lot of real estate that you can put solar panels on and things like that. None of it has anything to do with schools. And you would watch these school board meetings, and they would talk for hours and hours, literally, about things like menstrual equity, which is putting tampons in the elementary school bathrooms, which they had already been there, but then the janitors took them out because they were used 99% of the time for pranks. And so they became this giant crusade where the school board would sit around late into the night and like 1 a.m. talking about menstrual equity. And, another thing that caught my attention at that time was in Seattle, there was the equity department there started teaching that math is racist. And this is a city where Microsoft and Amazon are based. They need to hire programmers. They're trying to pay, frankly, a lot of money for people to do math-based jobs like programming. And we're not even producing people smart enough to do that in our American schools. So these employers are having to bring people in on H-1B visas. And she would tell people, this lady that was in charge of this thing, Tracy Castro-Gill, she would, the curriculum was basically saying, if you're black, math isn't for you. Math is a way to oppress you. And you would basically, to pass the class, you would have to say, how does math oppress me? And you would have to explain it. And it wasn't an option to say math does not oppress me. And so it was just so insidious because math is, first of all, a kind of the universal language. It certainly does not discriminate against black people. They're every bit as capable of learning it, and we want them to, and we want them to go on and make a lot of money, and that's the best way to close the income gap and all these things that liberals say they want to do. And this lady here, she is saying, if you're black, math isn't for you. And so you look at the Seattle achievement gap and all this stuff, it's the worst in the country, and it's getting worse. And they've been doing these equity programs for 20 years. And so I was just so struck by that. The third thing in 2019 that I saw going on was a push for 1970s style busing, race-based busing where they would change what school you were going to go to based on your race. And this was happening in, one of the counties in Maryland near me, and then the neighboring county started doing it, and then my county wanted to do it. And it was almost spreading like a contagion. It was almost coordinated because they were all doing the same thing at the same time. And none of it made any sense. They couldn't explain why they were doing it. They would say, well, on average, schools with a lot of rich people in them have higher test scores, so we want to make there be less schools with poor people in them. But it's like they don't understand what averages are, because when I would ask them, well, is there evidence that when you take a poor kid and put him in sitting next to rich kids, does it rub off on him? Does his scores go up? And the evidence shows clearly that that does not happen. So there was no evidence for busing, but they were doing it anyway. And so in Howard County, Maryland, which started doing this, they had public comment, and literally 99.7, I believe, % of the comments were against busing, and they did it anyway. It says 6,000 kids had to leave their friends, all for no reason, and they're kind of uprooting communities, and it was really personal. I've done a lot of big stories involving huge amounts of money and high-level government stuff, but people started calling me about that story who lived in that county that were affected, and some of them were like grown men who were literally crying because they felt like their everyday, it was personal. Their family had been affected. Their kids were being torn away from their friends. Their neighborhood didn't feel as cohesive anymore. And so I started realizing, I was just so struck by the fact that Washington doesn't matter. Frankly, the Congress can pass whatever bills they pass. A lot of them are stupid bills, but is it really going to hurt us? Really, we're not probably going to feel the impact day to day. And the things that local, town, and county governments do, we feel them so personally. And it's, crime with the prosecutors. Are you going to have these prosecutors that don't put people in prison for committing crimes? It's zoning. Are they going to, build high rises everywhere? It's schools. And these are really the three things that impact your life. And so in 2019, I became, started thinking about schools, and no one was really thinking about it at the time. And so I started pitching a book. I said, I want to write a book about suburban school boards and how they actually are not the most boring thing imaginable. And it was like a joke. It was like the irony, if there was ever a chance that this was going to be a book, it was because the pitch was so counterintuitive. Because it seemed obvious at that time that suburban school boards were boring. That's what everyone thought. And so I was working with Peter Schweitzer, the author of Clinton Cash, and I kind of sold him on the idea. He's a really smart guy who always tends to be like 5 years ahead of the curve. He was writing about Hunter Biden 5 years ago, and all the things you're hearing now, he said it, 5 years ago. And he believed in this book because he said, you sold me, the schools do matter. It's actually anything but boring. And what had happened is, as I said, when we're all looking in this direction, looking at the presidency and Congress, these really nefarious, highly motivated, well-funded forces had snuck in and infiltrated our school districts, and not just the liberal districts. There's that map that you see often that shows the red counties and the blue counties, and it's overwhelming how much of the county is actually conservative, at least when it comes to land mass. And then people point out, well, actually, those little blue dots, there's a lot of people packed into them. And that's true, of course, when we're talking about the popular vote for the presidency. But if you think about it, the geographical area that's all red, that should correspond to the percentage of school boards which are conservative, because we have 13,000 school districts all over. The vast majority of them are going to be in those red areas. So if 87% of those, that land mass is red, is it true that 87% of our school districts have a conservative bias, not a liberal one? Of course not. That's what's so striking, is they don't care what parents think, they don't care what residents think. They have completely taken over these schools for reasons that most people don't agree with, but that actually are not even effective, even according to their own stated aims, like the Seattle trying to make everything racially equal. Seattle and Minnesota, Minneapolis is the other place most of this stuff is coming from. They both have the worst racial disparities in the country. And it's in spite of doing all the liberal stuff that you could imagine. And so what's happening to schools all over the country, if you live in like Iowa now, what you're seeing is Minneapolis on a 10-year delay. All of this stuff has been tried before. It's not that these ideas about equity are unproven, they've been disproven. We know they don't work, even by liberals' own stated goals. So it is really pretty frightening stuff, and I started just poking around my own, where I live, because as I said, that's the easiest thing to do. And I kind of became known for, as Jane mentioned, is breaking this story about Loudoun County covering up a rape. And it wasn't really that hard to do. It's the kind of thing that you guys can do too. It just involved paying attention to my local schools, not really believing the spin when you have people that work there and they're trying to just get you out of their way, telling you blah, 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 go away. You just don't listen to them. You use your common sense and you're persistent. And so there was this guy a little over a year ago, you guys might remember seeing him on the news, where basically there was this guy, this middle-class, blue-collar guy that got arrested at a school board meeting. And he had kind of a bloody face and was being dragged away by the cops. And all the news stations were putting this guy out there as the face of, you know, the evil right-wing, probably white supremacist who's wreaking havoc at his local school board meeting because he's a bigot. And I learned about him the same way that everyone else did, just seeing him on CNN, etc. And I did something that was pretty easy, but that no other media outlet seemed to do, which is call him up and say, hey, we've all seen that you were really angry that day. Why were you angry? And that's all I did. He explained to me why he was so angry at that school board meeting, and it turned out he had a really good reason for being angry. And the reason was his daughter had been raped in a school bathroom, his 9th grade daughter, by a boy wearing a skirt. And the reason he was mad at that particular meeting was because they were trying to pass a transgender policy that would let transgender kids go into the girls' bathroom or whatever. And there were some parents who objected to that and raised the obvious issues. And the superintendent got up there and lectured them and says, excuse me, there's no reason to be acting like this would be a problem unless you're a bigot. I read in Time magazine that there's no such thing as the transgender predator, and I can tell you that we have no record of any bathroom incidents ever occurring in Loudoun County. And he went back and forth a couple times with the school board members, and he kept doubling down, there's never been any bathroom incident. And so here this father is in the audience, and he knows that just 3 weeks prior, this exact thing has happened to his daughter. And so they're lying about it. And, you know, he tells me that, and I take my time carefully verifying. I don't want to just take his word for it, but everything he said checks out. And it turns out that the school board has lied repeatedly about it. They filed paperwork with the state, also concealing this. And they did it because they wanted to pass this policy that, understandably, if the parents knew this had happened, it would have been awful hard to pass this policy. And so they concealed it, and they were willing to harm children because, as a result of concealing this, the kid stayed in school, and he was able to assault another girl in the classroom. And meanwhile, the father, after he got hauled off of that school board meeting, and by the way, the cops were kneeling on his neck while he was screaming, "I can't breathe," which is something that we thought liberals didn't like, but they were okay with it in this case. You know, the prosecutor, who was funded by George Soros, and he dumped $850,000 into this far-left woman's prosecutor's race. And this is a race that normally cost about $100,000 total. And it was a conservative politician who was beaten by 1% thanks to this massive influx of money. So she personally takes the case of prosecuting the father of this rape victim. And this is unheard of. It's a pretty large county. You get prosecuted by the assistant DAs. The elected prosecutor doesn't show up. Certainly not for a misdemeanor or disorderly conduct. And so the elected Soros prosecutor personally tried to put the father of the rape victim in prison, while the actual rapist did not go to prison. And this was, you know, so shocking because he was just a dad doing what any other dad would do. Was he mad? Sure. You know, did he lose his temper? Of course, but who wouldn't? And there was a woman there, the actual precipitating event, where the cops, and all they did is put his hand on his arm, and then he didn't know who was behind him, so he just kind of jerked his arm away. And that's when the cops just tackled him. That's all he did. But the reason he was even kind of animated in the first place is because a far-left activist was there saying, "We don't believe you about your daughter." Because he was in that video, the video that CNN was playing around the clock. His wife was screaming while he had handcuffs on, "My daughter was raped in the bathroom at school, and this is what happened." So it wasn't a secret, but CNN didn't tell you that. They literally took this guy, they edited the video so that it didn't have that part, and they just showed him looking angry with handcuffs on. And so this poor guy, he told me that he's a plumber, and every morning he likes to take if he has an early job working on someone's pipes, he likes to bring their newspaper into their house with him. And for a long time, every time he brought in a newspaper, it had his bloody face on it. Because the media, that was taking this guy, no one asked why he was mad. And they were willing to harm kids to advance their political agenda in schools. And I think that story really mattered, not because of what happened to one person in Loudoun County, but because it's a metaphor for what they've been doing a long time all across the country in every school district. They're willing to harm kids to advance their agenda. There is really no, I think, more urgent concern for us to get involved in than schools, because here we are in Silicon Valley. It's kind of the cradle of innovation, and we need the kind of innovation that's coming out of places like this, the developments in technology and healthcare that save lives and make the quality of life better for everyone. Those don't just happen. They happen because we have smart people that are working hard. And what we are telling our children now in taxpayer-funded schools is that hard work and meritocracy and objectivity don't exist. That's literally what they're telling these kids. And I have the worksheets where they tell them, that at least the teachers in these teacher trainings, these things. So that is, basically critical race theory. I usually call it equity, because that's what the school systems call it. If you say CRT, they'll just say we're not doing that, which is, really pedantic and manipulative. But if you just call it equity, they can't deny that they're doing it. Equity is a very bad thing. Equity means bringing everyone down to the lowest common denominator so that we can have equal outcomes. And so, a lot of times you see things like the school shutdowns and the obvious results, and they justify the school shutdowns on grounds of equity and racial disparities around who gets coronavirus. And now what you're seeing is they're complaining about the racial disparities and who was harmed by the school shutdowns. So it's really just constant complaining. That's what CRT is. And, basically there's 5 tenets of CRT according to, I've read all their papers. They love to say, people don't know about CRT. I know about CRT. I had the advantage of getting paid for, a year and a half to write a book about schools. I read all the papers. You haven't missed anything if you haven't read them. They're very, it's, the kind of thing Dr. Jill Biden would write, but I would not, by the way, want Dr. Jill Biden to operate on me. I think I'd select Dr. Dre if I had to select a physician out of the two. But, basically, the first tenet of CRT is permanence of racism. So it's just saying racism is present in every situation in America. And it's you exercise this theory by finding the racism. So it's really a parlor game. Take any situation and figure out how you can torture logic enough to find some way that hidden racism is present in that situation. And it's like the amount of contortions they'll go through is pretty funny, because that's the game. CRT doesn't provide solutions. It's just a hammer looking for nails to call racist. The second tenet is whiteness as property. So what that means, and they use this really kooky language that's like impenetrable, but what whiteness as property means is that CRT doesn't actually oppose white people for being white. It opposes whiteness, which it defines as anything that's dominant. And that's actually much worse than hating white people, if you can believe it, because that means they hate things just because they're dominant. Just because something works, and just because society functions on something, we should try to tear it down. And so that's one of the ways that they call Asian people white, because they dominate at science and math. And so therefore, you can be an Asian white supremacist or whatever. But it goes beyond that. They also call the scientific method racist or whiteness because it's dominant in the fields of science. I mean, I can't imagine why scientists would use the scientific method, but I hear it's dominant among scientists. And so therefore, the scientific method is whiteness. And this isn't like hyperbole or extrapolation. This is coming from their papers, these academic papers that they write. And so CRT opposes the scientific method. The third tenet is counter-storytelling. So if you've rejected, which basically means lying, counter-storytelling means if all the objective data says one thing, well, then you can tell a story about how you feel based on your identity, and we're going to elevate that. So it's valuing the subjective and the emotional over the factual. So the problem there is, of course, what if I feel one way and you feel another? We both have different subjective realities. Who wins? Well, it's simple. The definition of counter-storytelling includes only stories which help advance CRT. So it's a philosophical framework that's kind of self-reinforcing because its definition of what matters is something that helps advance their own cause. The fourth tenet is interest convergence, which means if you do everything that the CRT people want, and the far left is always badgering you to do this, do that, or else you're racist. Well, according to CRT, even if you do every single thing that they say, they admit they will still call you racist. Because they say, well, if you do everything they say, you're a white person, so you must just be doing it for you. There must be some benefit for you. If you're doing the things we tell you to do, you must secretly be trying to pull one over on us. And so the fifth tenet, the final tenet of CRT, is critique of liberalism. And that's what it sounds like. CRT is illiberal, and they hate liberals. They hate liberals because liberals believe traditional classical liberals, but also contemporary political liberals, like the Democratic Party of the 1990s. The CRT people hate them because they're too sane. They believe in things like innocence, presumption of innocence until guilty, that you should, if you're accused of something, you should go to court and someone should have to present evidence. CRT throws all that out the window, and they're very explicit about it. And so that's one of the interesting things here with what we're seeing in the takeover of schools is this isn't about conservative versus liberal. It's about illiberal ideas versus everyone else. And basically there's a tiny minority, I think, of people who believe this crazy stuff. A lot of them work as consultants and so on, but they were the ones showing up, and they're the ones getting contracts to create these training materials and things like that. But it really does affect everyone. I mean, obviously people talk a lot about San Francisco all over the country, what happened just a couple months ago, I guess, with the school board recalls, because that says everything you need to know right there. Even the city of San Francisco is saying these woke people, they will burn everything to the ground. Just think about, everything you just heard about CRT. It's a method that says we oppose anything that's dominant. It's just literally like a self-fulfilling. It just says if anything works, we oppose it. It's just anarchy. These are angry people that don't have any solutions, and they will find negativity in any scenario. And so, you can talk about politics all day, but one of the things that really bothers me as a parent is at the end of the day, I want my kids to be smart, but even more so, I want my two little girls to be happy. And this stuff is negative that they're pushing in the schools. It doesn't matter what race you are, it doesn't matter what income you are. They want your kids to be plagued with anxiety and sadness and guilt. And that's not, it just breaks my heart as a parent. Kids deserve innocence and, that period of just being joyful. They don't have the context to grapple with the things that these teachers are force feeding them. Teachers are not, so basically I spent almost 2 years writing this book, really investigating what's going on in the schools. And sometimes people say, well, in 30 seconds, how do you fix the schools? Of course you can't. I mean, if you could hear about or do, fix the schools in 30 seconds, they would already be fixed. It is complicated. There's a lot going on, but if I had to distill it down into 4 groups of really bad people, the first one is the billionaire foundations that are bankrolling a lot of the stuff in the schools. You haven't heard a lot about schools until recently, except about 10 years ago you heard about Common Core, which was Obama's big thing. And you probably remember hearing about how the Gates Foundation was behind it. So Bill Gates spent a ton of money basically manipulating all of these states into giving up control, conservative states mostly. He would just hire lobbyists and astroturfed op-ed campaigns and things like that to get conservative states to give up control of their own standards. And so the point is, we spend almost $1 trillion on schools. There's 13,000 school districts. It's pretty hard to steer that ship, right? You have to be pretty powerful to influence them. And the Philanthropic Foundations are the group that are able to do that. And just as Gates pushed this Common Core 10 years ago, now it's the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Casey Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, MacArthur Foundation. They're the ones pushing CRT. And you pick any problem in the schools now, or any fringe activist group who's, attached themselves to education, you usually find that behind the scenes is the foundations. So it's like this complicated web of money flying around, but it's always one step removed from these groups. And I was really struck by how insidious and how almost sadistic these groups are. Kellogg, Ford, Rockefeller. It's all these rich guys from 100 years ago, right, who had these monopolies. And they tended to be capitalists, but they tended to be, basically they tended to be racist. 100 years ago, these foundations got together and started doing eugenics. And so they would meet at the compound of the Kellogg brothers, who you know from, of course, breakfast cereals. And they would talk about things like, of course, we all know that the Negro male is inferior, but we also must be aware of the Oriental, for if we don't keep him down, they're going to, show us up in business. And so it's like horrible, crazy, racist stuff that they're saying 100 years ago. But if you fast forward to the present day, they're saying similar things now with controversies, if you want to call it that, like Lovell High School here in San Francisco or Stuyvesant in New York City, where you have these magnet schools and the Asians, the left gets really mad because the Asians are doing good at math and science by working hard. And so they said, well, we've got to get rid of the tests. It's like there's this continuity of the racism of these philanthropic foundations. And they are really behind almost everything. You look at the 1619 Project, that is the MacArthur Foundation every step of the way. And it's not just that they funded the article that came out of the New York Times 2 years ago. For 10 years, they had been working on Nicole Hannah-Jones's career, funding her every step of the way, setting it up, also paying other people who she then consulted for the 1619 Project. And then after she was done with the New York Times, they paid $5 million to get her this professor seat. They're almost puppeteers. They're constantly behind the scenes plotting. None of this stuff happens by accident. And so it's not just that they're the funders that are subsidizing people that would be doing this stuff anyway. What the philanthropic foundations like Ford Foundation do is when they say, well, our grant priorities for the upcoming 5 years are racial equity and education, suddenly every nonprofit in the country that never had interest in that topic before is suddenly very interested, because that's how you get the grant money. That's how you put in the grant proposal and you're going to actually get the money if you focus on that topic. So the philanthropic foundations are the first group that are really important to know. We hear about George Soros all the time, and you hear about the Clintons and all the other stuff that conservatives talk about. You don't often hear about the Ford Foundation. You think of them as the rich people that fund art museums. That's not the case. These are fringe, far left groups that have been, they fund groups all the time that literally say we want to get rid of capitalism and take control of, seize control for the state of major industries, and really fringe stuff. They're completely outside of the mainstream. So the second group in schools is what I call the Charlatan Consultants. And these are the people that come in and they have these companies that say, well, if you think your schools might be racist, but you're not sure, we can do a little test for you and we'll find out. And of course, they always find your schools are deeply racist. You're going to need to hire us for our largest package to fix these schools. And so they did that, for example, in Loudoun County. There was this problem where someone claimed that the kids were being forced to pretend to be slaves as part of a PE exercise, and that showed how the school system was racist. And so they hired this consulting firm who came in and said, yep, that means you're racist. Well, it turns out that they were working with consultants who ran that very same exercise as an anti-racist exercise. So the company that was happy to take the money and say, oh, you made kids pretend to be slaves, you're going to have to pay us. They also collected money to tell kids to pretend to be slaves because they said that was anti-racist. So that's oftentimes the only difference, whether something is racist or anti-racist, is who's getting paid. The main thing, what I was really struck by is how one guy named Glenn Singleton is responsible for so much of what's happening in the schools now. And he's a consultant who runs a group called Pacific Education Group, but you mostly hear of it through its trademark or whatever, Courageous Conversations. So if you've ever heard that phrase, Courageous Conversations, your school, superintendent or whatever, they make it seem like they're just saying, let's have courageous conversations. That's just basically the telltale sign that they're paying this guy. So he is a guy who's from Baltimore. He's a black guy, but he had a very unusual upbringing. He went to a Jewish day school, which was very elite, where he was head of the horseback riding club. His hobbies were singing and dancing and show tunes. He went on to an Ivy League college, and then he lived in Beverly Hills. And so one day he said, I always had this nagging chip on my shoulder. Am I Glenn Singleton black enough? And so it was obvious that this guy, through having this very privileged life, there was something weird going on he had some identity complex where he felt like he didn't have the black identity that he thought he should. So he gets this idea, I can have school systems pay me to teach other kids what it's like to be black. And so he was hired by places like Baltimore City that's like, none of our kids can read, but I know what we need to do, teach our kids how to be black. And we're going to hire the whitest guy we know to do it. So none of it made any sense. It's clearly this guy acting out his own, weird identity complex. And he's the one who in the 1990s started putting out these teacher trainings, saying things like the worship of the written word. That's what white people do. They worship the written word. In our culture, the black culture, we don't care about reading. He would say like racist, crazy stuff like that. Showing up on time is a white thing. We don't do that in the black culture. And so he started basically saying, hard work and objectivity, getting the right answer, those are white things, and you shouldn't have to do it if you're black. And he was hired by places like Seattle, and basically this is where CRT kind of first started getting into the school system through this total charlatan who didn't have any real credentials. There was no data backing up anything what he was saying, but the schools would just hire him, and so. The question that brings us to the third group, which is the self-interested administrators, meaning, okay, all this stuff is going on in the schools, but why? Why are they inviting these lunatics? We know there's partisans out there who are on the fringe. We know there's stupid people out there in America. Why are the schools inviting them in? And the answer is because it's all about statistical manipulation. It's about covering up their failures to teach our children reading, writing, and science. That's what this is all about, and that's the thing that I was most struck by writing this book. Is I was prepared for all the politics. I can do the stuff where we make fun of the left for being crazy, but my honest assessment of the schools is it's not even about partisanship. They're using the language of the left to conceal the fact that our kids are just not being taught how to do the only thing that schools are supposed to be doing. And so you look at the data, the performance measures, and only 36% of our 12th graders can read. How are we going to have a first world country like that? These are 18-year-olds. They're going to vote. They're going to get a job the next year. The figure is even worse for math. Only 24% are proficient. This is in 12th grade. American history, it's 11%. So when the immigrants come in and they take the citizenship test, the immigrants all pass it. It's the Americans who can't pass it. So the statistics are terrible. It's not because schools are underfunded. We spend $17,000 a year per kid. That was before coronavirus. It's well over that now. Funding has doubled since 1980, adjusted for inflation. And so they constantly lie, right? They say, well, it's because of lack of funding, or other kids in rich places have better schools because property taxes fund schools. Not true. Since the 90s, the state has given the lion's share of the money. They say that, if you're rich and white, you get more money spent on you. Not true. We have programs like Title I and many others at the state level that mean that if you're a poor or minority, you actually get more money spent on your education than white people. They come up with all these excuses, but more importantly, they hire the consultants to do the CRT stuff precisely because it says things like tests are racist and objectivity isn't real and meritocracy is a myth. Because if you can say that there's no such thing as, getting the right answer on a math test, suddenly you're not a total piece of crap at your job for not being able to teach kids how to get the right answer on that math test and having those 24% proficiency rates despite spending $17,000 per kid. Because just think about how much money that is, 17 grand per kid times 20 to 30 in a classroom. Basically that's what I found is that everything that's going on in the schools traces back to the school administrators manipulating statistics so that they can look good without having to be good. It's almost like Enron. They're moving numbers around on a page. And even coming back to the busing that first caught my eye, I finally realized why they wanted to do that. And so they know for a fact that if you take a poor kid and move him across town so he's sitting next to a rich kid, he's not suddenly going to know how to read. Reading isn't contagious. They did it because when you see the statistics on the page and you're like, oh my God, there's this school in the poor part of town where only 10% of kids can read, you go, man, those administrators, we should fire the superintendent, we should get new school board members. If they can take those illiterate kids and sprinkle them all over town, they're still illiterate, and they know they're going to still be illiterate, but they're able to kind of fly beneath the radar that way. And so that's how it is with things like Lovell, too, all right? I mean, things like Lovell and Stuyvesant are so important. They give, they're the embodiment of the American dream. And there's a reason why so many people there are Asian. They come here with nothing, and they work around the clock, and they study hard, and they've got that supportive family that values education, and they're able to succeed. Why? Because America is not oppressive. And that contradicts what the teachers want to tell the kids. You can look at the education professors have a conference once a year, and you can look at the index of what they talk about. And they talk about critical race theory 3 times more than they talk about reading. That's an official statistic. They don't even talk about academic achievement. But they're telling kids that you can't succeed, but you can. The Asians prove it pretty well, and so they say, well, we've got to harm the Asians now. And they have one of the ways you see CRT, and even though I usually like to call it equity, you look at these CRT papers, and it's all about black versus white, because it's from the basically these 90s academics, and in the 90s it was more of a black versus white thing in America. We have now way more Hispanics and way more Asians. You will never see the left talk about Hispanics, and you will hear them talk about Asians only in a negative way around schools. I mean, you saw Jill Biden today, or yesterday, call Hispanics tacos, right? And they call them Latinxes, or whatever you pronounce. That's how I pronounce it, Latinx. I call it Latinx. But that's CRT. CRT thinks that America is blacks fighting whites. And that's just not remotely corresponding to what, especially at the K through 12 level, the lay of the land is. You have Asians who are the fastest growing population. You have Hispanics who vastly outnumber blacks when you're talking about young kids. And yet the left only talks about blacks, and they completely ignore the problems that are actually going on, and they don't have any track record of solving any of these problems. So I think some interesting political realignments are occurring. We did see that here in San Francisco with the recall of the school board members, largely I think over Lovell as I understand it, but you guys probably have a better sense than I do. But also the school closures. And we were watching across the country repulsed by the San Francisco school board as they tried to rename schools while the schools were not open. And it's like you're putting lipstick on a pig here. You're changing the way we perceive things instead of just fixing the problem. And so, the LA Times has reported now that something like 1/3 of the kids in Los Angeles are lost. They just never showed back up for school. Because who would have thought if you shut down schools for 2 years, some of these kids are just off the grid now. And so the schools, the unions are very partisan, but they care about themselves, and they will always choose their own self-interest, even over leftist politics. And so you saw them intentionally, or not intentionally, but you saw them predictably hurt poor and minority kids by shutting down schools. They knew it was going to happen. They didn't care. They didn't want to go to work, and they didn't show up for 2 years. But a lot of this stuff has been going on for longer than we've paid attention to it. It's not like the schools started talking about race in 2019 or 2020. It wasn't because of George Floyd or Black Lives Matter. I know that the rest of society started becoming obsessed with race around that time, but it was in schools for much longer. It basically went into schools around 2001 when No Child Left Behind was passed, which is bipartisan legislation that just brought, among other things, it said you should publish school statistics online. Because it's, 2001, the internet's coming around. They say, let's put up online what the test scores are and what the graduation rates are. And so that sets off this race to the bottom where what a decent person would do if their graduation rate was abysmal is try to teach the kids better. What a bad person would do, and those people are in charge of schools in America, is make it easier to graduate and then report that the graduation rate is going up. And so it all comes back to manipulating statistics and lowering standards, and now they've thrown race into the mix, and they want to bring everyone down to whatever the lowest performing racial group is. But this has been going on for a long time. There's an article that was printed by the Los Angeles Times about 10 years ago. Even though it was in the Los Angeles Times, it's about a camp that was up here in Northern California. It was called Camp Diversity. And so they would take these kids who were mostly from impoverished schools, and they would physically and emotionally abuse them to make them feel oppressed. So the adults would scream at the Asian kids that they had small penises. They would sneak in while the kids were sleeping and plant drugs on the black kids, or I don't know if they were fake drugs or what, but to make it feel like the cops were out to get them. They made the Hispanic kids clean up. And there was a teacher who would slap kids in the back of the head to make them feel oppressed. And he gave a quote to the Los Angeles Times saying, yeah, I basically punch the kids in the head so they feel oppressed. So there are adults out there that want your children to be unhappy. They're doing that because they want these kids to feel like America is oppressive, even though there are people out there at places like Lovell who are showing that, in fact, America is a place where if we want to be happy, we can. So it's a profoundly negative thing. Santa Barbara, obviously you guys have the liberated ethnic studies here in California, which requires kids to learn very anti-Semitic stuff. Because it's mostly, it really is a weird cult. It's not like generic leftism. They have very specific beliefs. They really don't like Jews. And so there's this guy in Santa Barbara who, Santa Barbara is mostly Hispanic, some white, only 1% black. But fitting with the CRTs about black versus white, they have this ethnic studies guy, and he says his name is Matef Harmicus, which is the name of an Egyptian cult, a god in an Egyptian cult. And so he says, well, I'm an African leader, and as an African, blah, blah, blah. Well, he's actually from Bakersfield, and his name is George Barker. It's all a scam. He's not, he's pretending he's got the dashiki on or whatever. And so even though almost every kid is Hispanic, they're trying to make them do this black stuff in the name of ethnic studies, because that's what ethnic studies is about, this weird cult stuff. It's not helping kids reflect the diversity of the community or whatever. When there are Hispanics there, they tell them that they are Aztecs, and they're not Aztecs. Aztecs are an extinct civilization that murdered children and sacrificed them to the gods. They're telling just generic Latinos that they're actually Aztecs. So it really is kind of cultish. And so this guy Matef Harmicus was, basically he got suspended. He got put on paid leave for doing things like having this physical altercation with some Jewish kids for supporting Israel. And then a bunch of girls said that he was doing some perverted stuff. They put him on paid leave for like 5 years. He comes back, same deal, back on paid leave. Finally, he's convicted of assaulting a girl. Did an article about this where we talked to the girl, and she says she basically described some horrible sexual stuff that resulted in his criminal conviction. He still gets paid leave while he's already criminally convicted. And he, of course, blames racism, even though the girl is an illegal immigrant. So this is what's going on in the schools, and they spent like $1 million trying to fire him, but because of the union spent your taxpayer money keeping him in there. And they're, of course, invoking race every which way, but what they're really doing is harming children, and they're just using that leftist rhetoric to protect themselves. And so this is a guy that even since he's been, and once the state of California took away his teacher's license, they had no choice but to fire him, but he remained involved at the state level with the California Ethnic Studies. And so you can see the letters that he wrote saying Jews need to come out of this curriculum. Jews are not oppressed. Jews have not had it hard. So these are not kind people. These are not people that want diversity. It's like a cult mentality. And the way that I came to write a series of articles about Santa Barbara is because there was a woman there who grew up around people from the Jim Jones cult. And she recognized the same telltale signs that she saw growing up in the 1970s with Jim Jones going on around what they're doing with the kids in schools, where they have them chant in, Aztec chants and lie on the ground and pretend to be dead. It's ritualistic behavior. There's no educational component. But anyway, I better wrap it up so we can do some questions. But yeah, the teachers union is obviously the fourth group. I said I wanted to focus on 4 groups. The teachers unions, they run schools as employment centers for adults, which is not the role of schools. Do not exist to employ adults. They exist to educate children. It's their only job. If people like Randy Weingarten, the head of the teachers union, who has no kids, if they can have this kind of say over the schools, you can too. These are your schools. Even if you don't have kids in the schools, if you've never had kids or if your kids are grown, you're a resident and you're a taxpayer. These are your schools. And it's kind of even better if you can get up in their face not having kids. You don't have to worry about them somehow retaliating against you. So I always like to see some people with gray hair making a big scene before the school board, and maybe I'll write an article about it. So I better wrap it up, but I think Jane has some questions for me, and it was so great to be here with you guys.
Okay, so let's start off with the basic question that everybody has. I'm going to head back to the back of the room and collect the rest of the questions, but I think kind of the first question in the room is about charter schools and about school choice. Is it as bad in private schools and religious schools? What's happening?
Yeah, so that is one of the things that's really discouraging, is if you think that you could take your kids out of private school, public school, and put them in private, and the same thing could happen. Certainly it does. That crazy consultant that I mentioned, he actually makes a lot of money consulting for some of the most elite private schools that charge like 60 grand a year. So you got to do your research. Certainly private school is not a guaranteed way out of this stuff. But I think, certainly charter schools are more importantly vouchers, meaning school choice, where you're already paying taxes for this. You should get to choose if you want to spend that. The money is earmarked for your kid. Do you want to use that money and send them to private school? They like to say that the private schools are better because of money. That's not true. Private schools spend less money than public schools. That's what they don't want you to know. It's just that they get better results. I think, of course, we should do that. I think it's a political winner. It's one of the few things we can agree on as Americans. Overwhelming majorities of people, 2/3, want school choice, and that includes large majorities of poor black Democrats. And so this is one of the areas where the teachers' unions really reveal themselves as being, protecting their own financial interest rather than helping Americans and kids, and especially minority kids. One of the ways that school choice could help is that it also would help force the public schools to do better, because they would have to care. Because we would have a choice, if you don't like a business, you can take your money and walk away. That's not the case with schools. They don't care if you leave or not. But I don't think that we should only focus on that. I think Republicans did that for a long time. If you ask them about education, they would say, I don't know, I don't follow it, I couldn't tell you who my school board members are, but the RNC says we should do school choice. Fine, but it's not a substitute, because in the meantime, we've got kids in public schools, and even if we have school choice, there's still going to be kids in public schools. And when your kids grow up, even if you take them out and put them in private school, they're going to be living in a world where their peers, a world populated largely by public school graduates. And when we're graduating kids with a 36% literacy rate, we just can't sustain a first world country like that. So I say do both, but it is one of those things where the Democratic coalition kind of collapses because there are actually cross-partisan, bipartisan, strong support for vouchers. It's not the kind of thing that politicians are going to put on the ballot, but I know you guys, I don't know how California works on the ins and outs. I just know that you guys seem to have referendums a lot on the ballot. And I think if this is one of those things, if you could get school choice as a referendum where it's not the politicians making the law, it's the voters just simply taking a yes or no vote on whether you want school choice, I think it could win in California, and that would totally revolutionize everything.
Are there any teachers' movements standing up to CRT, Luke?
I'm not aware of that. I don't want to say they don't exist, but there's a lot of teachers who say that privately they don't agree with it, but they never seem to say so publicly. I don't feel so good about that. I know that they can retaliate against teachers in ways that are not, because they have you see all the things that the teachers get away with without being fired, and you think, is it really, how bad can it, why, if the teachers are not all buying into this horrific illiberal philosophy, why don't you hear more of them stand up against it? And they claim that they're going to be retaliated, and then you think, well, what about your union protections? Doesn't that mean you can't be fired? And they say, well, there's these subtle ways where basically they can make it very unpleasant for me to go into work. And I think that's true, but excuse me, there's 63 million of us with kids in schools whose lives are also being ruined if you let it happen. So that's just the way it is. It's the price of doing the right thing, is sometimes you have to endure some discomfort. So I'm kind of disheartened by the lack of visible resistance from teachers. on this. They all claim it's a vocal minority that's taken control of their profession. They've especially done it through the teachers' various associations, like not only the unions, but they'll be like the Math Teachers Association of America, and they'll get them together for conferences every year and say, well, you should teach this curriculum or that curriculum. And so they've really captured all the nodes of the teachers, of how to influence these teachers. But I think there's an opportunity. I know if there's teachers out there who are against this, I'd like to see them stand up, because we don't have too much time to lose before it's too late.
Okay. I like this. This is a really interesting and plain question. Please define a white supremacist.
I heard Tucker say the other day that he's never met one, and I don't know if I've ever met one either, right? I mean, a white supremacist under CRT is, I guess, anyone who's dominant in society, right? So, yeah, that is, under their definition, they make it be so broad that it's certainly going to lose its stigma. So, yeah, I think it's kind of an irrelevant question, right? I mean, it's a question that we spend too much time hearing about and thinking about, is racism in schools. They can start talking about race in schools once our kids can read. I'm comfortable making that bargain, because they've got such a long way to go. And that is kind of, they like to say, well, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. They clearly cannot. They are focusing on things like menstrual equity at the expense of very basic things. I like to look at time as a budget, right? When you're looking at money, if you're going to spend money on something, you've got to figure out where that money's coming from. What are you going to cut back on? And so every time they start telling you how they want to talk about slavery in every period or whatever, like, that's fine, but what is it coming at the expense of? And questions about white supremacy are irrelevant as it relates to education in America. What we need to care about is math and science and writing, and that should be something that we as Americans can all agree on.
Luke, do you want to update us on what's going on with the Loudoun County case? Because we know that the Attorney General was able to shut down an effort to stop the case from, or the attorney for the school board was trying to stop the case from going through, right? Can you update us on that? And
Yeah.
Let me ask a follow-up question from our audience. How many Loudoun school board members are going to jail for obstructing justice and, and covering up a crime?
Yeah, there's a criminal grand jury open right now, and the school board is doing the totally normal thing that totally innocent parties do, which is try to block a jury of their peers from investigating them for criminal behavior. So that grand jury is still ongoing. Maybe they'll find that there was malfeasance that was morally egregious but not criminal. Maybe they'll find that some people did lie in such a way that could have criminal consequences. But that's the update right now, as you see the school system in self-preservation mode, concerned about its image rather than doing the right thing. Governor Glenn Youngkin, who I think, the people realizing that these school districts were willing to harm their children, helped Glenn Youngkin win in a state that voted for Biden by 10 points, which I think gives them, here in Northern California, if it can happen in Virginia, it could happen here, who knows. But they're basically, we're seeing some reforms at the state level in Virginia as a result of this, but the school boards, ultimately most of the control comes from at the local level. So we'll have to see. Governor Youngkin wanted to put them on the ballot this year, and the Democrats blocked that. They don't want there to be they said it's a threat to our democracy, essentially, to have elections. So.
Could you say that again, please? It's a threat to our democracy to have elections.
Yeah, that's their new definition of the word democracy, includes holding elections. He wanted to have the elections this year rather than, 2 years from now. And the Democrats said, well, the longer we can go into the future, maybe people will forget. And so it's my hope that with what we learned where I live, people, of course, paid attention to the Loudoun stuff, but wherever you live, especially in California, the school shutdowns, so many people were woken up by that. But it's my hope that we won't go back to sleep now. because I love the quote that Jane mentioned early before I started my talk about, basically that if the egregious things we saw during the last 2 years, if the kind of people that did that, what have they been doing all these years? And I kind of show in my book how it's just a long continuity of the same self-serving behavior. It preceded, coronavirus and all this racial reckoning or whatever you want to call it, and it's going to continue going on. So I really encourage parents not to give up. The problem has not gotten any better. It's going to remain one of the most important things you can do as an American citizen to stay involved in your local school board.
Yeah. My eyes were sort of popping up reading your book. You were describing how effective these organizations are and how infiltrated we are. I think the American people have no clue what they're being delivered is really the sausage of this cult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I went on Tucker's show to talk about this stuff, and I told him about the PTA being totally taken over, and he just couldn't get over it. He said, "What's next? The Boy Scouts, well, those have already been taken." It's like, what's next? Apple pie. There's going to be like a Chairman Mao's going to jump out of an apple pie. The PTA does not represent you as parents, and that was one of it's almost like a controlled opposition. Like that's how it really angers me more than most of this stuff is that for all these years, we as parents who are busy and we do have jobs that we have to work, and when we're done with our jobs, we've got to take care of our kids and we've got to clean the house and cook dinner. And if we have a spare hour per week to be involved in our kids' education, previously we thought, I am an involved parent. I go to the PTA meetings every quarter. The PTA was never representing you as parents. The PTA is a teachers union front group that views parents' job to give the teachers extra money and to go to the kitchen and bake them cookies, right? It's the most misogynistic thing imaginable. Go to the kitchen, woman, make me some brownies. We'll sell them at a bake sale. Raise money. What do we need to raise money for? We already pay taxes for these schools. They get $17,000 per year per kid. Why would we pay extra? Why would we make brownies for the teacher? And have you ever heard the PTA go into a sort of watchdog mode and say, well, what's going on? We're going to pour over the budget of this school, or we think this policy isn't working, or we've looked at the statistics and violence is going up in the schools. The PTA never says any of that. They think the parents' role is to be a cheerleader for teachers. And that is not true. The teachers and the administrators work for us. But yeah, the teachers' unions are deeply connected to the PTA. They have people who are on the board of the National Education Association are also on the board of the PTA. And so there's why is the T even in the PTA, right? We need a parents' association. If you showed up as a parent to the teachers' union meeting, they wouldn't let you in. But they want the teachers to come into our parents' association. And what we saw during the pandemic is that parents' interests are not the same as teachers' interests. We have oftentimes diametrically opposed interests. And, that's what we need as a parents' association.
Would you clarify a little bit? We have a couple of questions about the foundations. What's the win for the foundations to support Common Core and CRT and keep people oppressed? What do they gain?
I don't really like to speculate what's in the mind of someone, but I could say that the effect is that it keeps minorities down, which is certainly what they wanted 100 years ago. These are the elites, the big rich families, and they're all sitting there in their New York City high-rises, the philanthropic executives now. And certainly the policies that they're imposing have the effect of keeping the poor and keeping minorities poor. It is, it's kind of disturbing what they're doing, and I don't know. Like I said, I don't want to assign motive, but if you look at their history, the language has changed, but their actions and their beliefs really haven't, since the days that they were deeply and overtly racist institutions.
One of our guests would like to points out that principles like objectivity, equality, and universality are principles that came from the Enlightenment. Would you say that CRT is contrary to this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you read these papers and they're pretty overt about it. It isn't like, me saying it. They'll be the first to admit they don't like these kind of principles. And so this is an area where the low information voter has been helpful to them. The average Democratic voter, and where you guys live, most voters are Democrat. Where I live, most voters are Democrat. I know that most of my neighbors don't support this stuff. My neighbors who vote for Democrats every year and they voted for Bill Clinton and things like that, they don't oppose the Enlightenment. They don't oppose, objectivity. Of course not. But they haven't been very informed. They've been voting in these local elections and they see like the D next to their name, or they'll say something that like signals that they hate conservatives. And they've totally kind of pulled a fast one on the normal Democratic voter who believes in liberal ideas instead of illiberal ideas. But CRT, when you look into it, is overtly illiberal. I mean, and then they admit it routinely.
Do you think there's a way to fix the teachers union, to weaken them, to affect them at all?
I don't think it can be fixed. I think they're doing their job. I mean, they voted down a motion to dedicate themselves to the betterment of education for all children.
And do they, excuse me, but do they not notice that people are pulling their kids out of the schools?
Yeah, I mean, that's why they don't want school choice. They don't want you to have the ability to go anywhere else. But they took some crazy votes this week. They had their national conference, and they want to not talk about moms anymore. You have to call them birthing people and so on. But they also wanted continued mandatory masking all over America for the foreseeable future. The teachers' unions can't be fixed. We can only limit their power. What I think would be interesting is the creation of new school districts, especially in areas where there's very large school districts now. If you could break away and start new ones and start fresh and not have any teachers' unions contracts. Obviously since the beginning of public sector unions, people have said, you can support unions when you're representing coal mine workers, but you don't need them for public sector people. The teachers have never worked in the coal mines. But yeah, there's really no reason to begin this kind of power because they have shown a ability and willingness to harm our kids.
Here's a message from a teacher who's not one of those. She says, I'm an 18-year public school teacher. Fortunately, as a special education teacher, I have more liberty to teach the truth. I've seen enough. That's why I'm running for school board now. Thank you for telling the truth tonight. I've seen it, and you're right. Can you, a couple more? Do you have the energy for a couple
That's
more?
fine with me.
Okay, I always want to be respectful of our East Coast guests. Could you tell us a little more? One of our audience members would like to know, could you tell us a little bit more about the ethnic studies curriculum in California?
I don't want to say the wrong thing. I'm not as up to speed on it because I'm not from California, but so it might be better to look into it on your own, and I think you'll be sufficiently shocked. Yeah, I think I'm familiar with it. I just don't want to misstate it. But yeah, there's a lot of there's anti-Semitic stuff. There was a big, some of the Jewish groups basically got Newsom to veto it, but then it kind of came back, and there's I think a dispute around math right now about how math fits into all that. So yeah, you look into it and you can actually read some of these papers and they have them chanting Aztec poems and doing all that stuff. It's really cultish stuff. They want the low information Democrat voter to think it's about, all races matter. Don't hate people because of their race. Of course, we all agree with that. What they're doing is something different entirely.
So, Luke, what's the end game for these people? They want to tank our intellectual capacity. They want to pit us against each other. What is the end game here?
Yeah, I think their view is if you burn the whole thing to the ground, then maybe out of the ashes can be reborn something that is too radical to currently be implemented. You can trace directly the groups that are involved in the schools now back to I guess it's called, what's it called, the Cloward and Piven, you guys, what's it called? Cloward and Piven, whose view was essentially bankrupt New York City through basically they said, you know, we want everyone to get welfare. Whether you need it or not, welfare should be dramatically expanded. And they pretended that they were doing it because they cared about poor people. And later it was revealed they actually just wanted New York City to declare bankruptcy, which it did in the 70s, so that the whole city could be screwed because it incurred all these debts that it couldn't pay. And then out of the ashes could be reborn. It would require federal intervention, and all these other things could happen to pass policies that otherwise wouldn't have mainstream support. So yeah, I think it's basically a kamikaze mission where they just want to bring us all down and then they can figure out what to do later. But of course, like with the Communist Party, when you have situations where most people are living in poverty, the people who are in charge of the thing usually do okay. And so that's kind of the CRT thing, is as leaders of CRT, they won't be affected by destroying quality of life for everyone else. But it really is about bringing everyone down to the lowest common denominator. And I think to some extent there's an ideological instinct there where they're not thinking clearly. They just think we want a utopian world where everyone is equal. And they don't have enough rationality to understand that it's actually a dystopia where everyone is equal, because we're all going to be equally poor, illiterate, and miserable.
On that cheerful note, equally poor, miserable, and illiterate. Sounds terrific. Anybody in? Right? Listen, I want to give Luke an opportunity to say hello to you and sell his terrific book. I highly, again, tell you it's actually a really good read, and I think you'll get a pen out and mark it up as much as I have. If you learned something tonight in this room, I know you did, please tell someone. Share Luke's book with someone. Please take that business card and give it to someone in a Starbucks line that you hear talking about America. Please be part of passing on the baton of liberty. Luke, we thank you so very much. It was an extraordinarily enlightening talk, and I think we're all really lucky that we have this that will spend their time and do their research, the research that needs to be done to ferret out this evil.
Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank the people in this room who are doing work in their own way by running for school board, and you guys for you know, when you're tired after a long day at work, doing your own part, filing FOIA requests, researching your school board members. What I do, you guys can do too, and I love to see what's going on with the activists and the others who are working so hard in this room. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you for watching our presentation. Please like and subscribe to our channel to get updates on new speakers, and consider joining the Liberty Forum of Silicon Valley. You can do so at our website. If you don't want to join, but want to support the principles of American liberty, you can make a tax-deductible donation via our website. The links are in the description. Thank you again, and stay free.